Stop. If you sign that, your company dies today. The words cut through the boardroom just as the clock on the glass wall clicked to 9:59 a.m. Jonathan Blake's pen hovered an inch above the contract, a $2.4 billion deal that would either secure his legacy or quietly destroy it. Around the long marble table, a dozen executives sat frozen, their tailored suits catching the soft glow of overhead lights, eyes shifting toward the voice that didn't belong. At the doorway stood Marcus Reed, a janitor in a faded navy uniform, one hand still gripping the handle of a mop, the other slightly raised as if he had just realized too late that he had spoken out of turn. For a moment, no one moved. Then a low chuckle broke the silence. "You've got to be kidding," one of the partners muttered, leaning back in his leather chair. Another shook his head, barely hiding a smirk. "Since when do janitors read contracts?" The tension in the room didn't explode, it tightened, like a wire being pulled just a little too far. Jonathan didn't laugh. His eyes stayed on Marcus, sharp, measuring, but cold. "Do you know where you are?" he asked, voice calm, controlled, the kind of calm that usually ended conversations before they began. Marcus swallowed, but he didn't look away. His chest rose slowly, steady, like he had already made peace with whatever would come next. "Yes, sir," he said quietly. "And I know what happens if you sign that." A few heads turned now, not in amusement, but in curiosity. Security, standing near the wall, shifted their weight, waiting for the signal. The clock ticked again. 9 hours 59 minutes and 30 seconds. Somewhere in the room, a phone vibrated softly against polished wood. Jonathan tapped the pen once against the paper, the sound small but sharp, echoing farther than it should have. "You have 5 seconds, he said, not raising his voice, "to explain why I shouldn't have you escorted out." Marcus took one step forward, the rubber sole of his shoe faint against the floor, and pointed, not at Jonathan, but at the contract. "Page 27, he said. "Middle paragraph. It looks standard, but it shifts every liability onto your company after the merger closes." A pause. Not disbelief. Not yet. Just stillness. One of the lawyers frowned, flipping pages quickly, the sound of paper suddenly loud in the silence. Another leaned in, eyes narrowing as he scanned the text. The air changed. It wasn't dramatic. It was subtle, like the room had inhaled and forgotten how to breathe out. Jonathan's pen didn't move. His fingers tightened slightly, just enough for the light to catch the tension in his knuckles. "That clause," Marcus continued, voice steady, "doesn't protect you. It buries you." And for the first time since he spoke, no one laughed. The lawyer's fingers slowed as he reached the middle of the page, his eyes scanning once, then again, slower this time, as if the words had shifted when no one was looking. The faint hum of the air conditioning filled the silence, steady and indifferent, while the city stretched far below the floor-to-ceiling windows, unaware of how close everything was to collapsing inside this room. Jonathan Blake did not look up. His gaze dropped to the document, sharp and focused, the kind of focus that had built his empire deal by deal, detail by detail. He flipped to page 27 himself, the paper brushing lightly against his fingertips, and for a brief second, nothing changed. Then his eyes stopped. Not dramatically. Not all at once. Just a slight pause, almost invisible, like a crack forming beneath polished glass. Across the table, one of the senior partners leaned forward, his earlier confidence thinning. "It is a standard liability clause," he said, but his voice did not carry the same certainty as before. Another executive adjusted his glasses, reading silently, lips pressing together, as the meaning settled in. The words were subtle, buried in language that sounded harmless, even protective, but the direction of responsibility had been quietly reversed. If anything went wrong after the merger, every loss, every lawsuit, every consequence would fall on Jonathan's company alone. The other firm would walk away untouched. The clock ticked again. 10 a.m. The exact moment the deal was meant to be signed. Jonathan's pen lowered, but instead of touching the paper, it hovered just above it, suspended in a stillness that now felt heavy, deliberate. He exhaled slowly, the sound controlled but deeper than before, and placed the pen down beside the contract. No one spoke. Not the lawyers, not the partners, not even the security standing near the door. The room had shifted, not in volume, but in weight. What had been routine seconds ago now felt fragile, like one wrong move could undo everything. Jonathan finally looked up, his eyes moving past the executives, past the polished table, and landing on Marcus, who still stood near the doorway, shoulders straight, hands at his sides, the mop resting quietly against the wall behind him. There was no triumph in his expression, no urgency, just a steady calm, as if he had already said everything that needed to be said. Jonathan studied him for a moment longer than anyone expected, then turned his attention back to the table. "Why?" he asked slowly, his voice lower now, more measured. "Did no one else catch this?" No one answered. Papers shifted slightly. A chair creaked. Somewhere, a glass of water trembled just enough to ripple the surface. The partner who had spoken earlier cleared his throat, but the words did not come. The silence that followed was not empty. It was full of realization. And standing just outside the circle of power, Marcus Reed remained exactly where he was, no longer invisible, no longer dismissed, but not yet acknowledged either, caught in the quiet space between being overlooked and being seen. Jonathan Blake did not move immediately, but something in his posture had shifted, the rigid confidence replaced by a quieter, more deliberate stillness, as if every assumption in the room was being recalculated in real time. His fingers rested lightly on the edge of the contract, not gripping it, not pushing it away, just holding it there like it suddenly carried weight far beyond paper. Across the table, the senior partner who had led the negotiations straightened his tie, the motion small but telling, his earlier ease replaced by a tension he could not quite hide. "It is a technical interpretation," he said carefully, choosing each word as if it might be examined under a microscope. "The clause is not uncommon in complex mergers." Jonathan's gaze lifted slowly, not sharp, not aggressive, but focused in a way that made the explanation feel thin before it had even finished forming. "Technical does not mean harmless," he replied, his voice steady, almost quiet, but carrying enough weight to settle the room again. The lawyer who had been flipping through the pages earlier cleared his throat and leaned forward, his pen tapping lightly against the margin. "Sir, if I may," he said, adjusting his glasses, "the language does appear to shift post-closing liability entirely onto Blake Holdings. It is unusually broad." The pause before his last words lingered, heavy and unmistakable. A faint reflection of the skyline shimmered across the polished table, distorted by the slightest movement of hands and papers, while outside, traffic moved in slow, distant patterns, indifferent to the tension building inside the room. Jonathan leaned back in his chair, the leather creaking softly, his eyes no longer on the contract but on the people around him, one by one, measuring reactions, weighing silence against explanation. Some avoided his gaze. Others held it briefly, then looked down again. The balance of power had not disappeared, but it had shifted just enough to be felt. Near the door, Marcus remained still, his presence no longer dismissed as background, yet not fully invited into the center either, existing in that narrow space where truth had already been spoken but not yet acknowledged. Jonathan finally turned his head slightly toward him, not fully, just enough to bring him into his line of sight. "You said it would bury the company," he said, not as a challenge, but as a continuation, as if the conversation had simply paused and now resumed. Marcus nodded once, his expression calm, his voice even. "Yes, sir. If anything goes wrong after the deal closes, even something small, every cost comes back here. Lawsuits, penalties, everything. It would not matter who caused it. It would all be yours." The words settled into the room without resistance this time, no laughter, no dismissal, only the quiet recognition that the risk had been real, and dangerously close. Jonathan's jaw tightened slightly, not in anger, but in focus, the kind that came when a decision was no longer optional. He reached forward, closed the folder slowly, and placed both hands on top of it, pressing it flat against the table as if sealing the moment in place. "We are not signing this today," he said. No raised voice. No dramatic pause. Just a statement, clean and final. A subtle shift rippled across the table, chairs adjusting, papers being gathered, but no one argued. The authority in his tone did not need reinforcement. Then, after a brief silence, he added, "This meeting is over." Chairs slid back with soft friction against the polished floor, the kind of quiet movement that usually followed a successful deal, but this time carried something else, something restrained and unsettled. No one spoke as they gathered their folders, their devices, their carefully neutral expressions returning like masks being put back into place. The senior partner avoided Jonathan's gaze as he closed his briefcase, his earlier confidence now reduced to a tight nod that did not quite meet the moment. One by one, they exited the room, their footsteps measured, controlled, as if leaving too quickly might reveal something they were not ready to admit. The door opened, then closed, and with it, the weight of the meeting seemed to shift again, settling into a quieter, more personal silence. Only a few remained now. The legal team lingered near the far end of the table, exchanging low, careful words, while security stepped back toward the wall, no longer tense, no longer needed. And near the doorway, Marcus Reed still stood where he had been, his posture unchanged, his presence steady, as if the storm had passed but he had not moved an inch. Jonathan did not rise immediately. He sat there for a moment, hands still resting on the closed folder, eyes fixed not on the contract, but on the reflection of the room and the glossy surface beneath it. The skyline shimmered faintly across it, distorted by the angle, by the light, by everything that had just happened. Then he stood. Not abruptly. Not dramatically. Just a controlled motion, deliberate and grounded, like someone stepping into a decision that had already been made. The room felt different now, less like a stage, more like a space where something real had just been exposed. Jonathan walked around the table, his steps slow, measured, the soft echo of each one marking the distance between where he had been sitting and where Marcus stood. He stopped a few feet away, close enough now that the contrast between them was impossible to ignore. The tailored suit, the polished shoes, the authority that came with them, standing across from a man in a simple uniform, hands slightly worn, shoulders steady, eyes calm. For a brief moment neither spoke. The silence was not awkward. It was precise. Intentional. Jonathan studied him, not with suspicion now, but with something more focused, something closer to recognition. "How did you see it?" he asked finally, his voice lower than before, stripped of the sharp edge it had carried earlier. Marcus took a breath, not rushed, not hesitant. Just steady. "It was left open in the copy room," he said. "I noticed the wording. It did not match the structure of the earlier clauses." Jonathan's eyes narrowed slightly, not in doubt, but in concentration, as if replaying the details in his mind. "You read contracts in your spare time?" he asked. There was no mockery in the question, only curiosity, quiet but direct. Marcus gave a small nod. "I try to understand things," he replied. "My father used to say details are where people hide the truth." The words lingered, simple, but grounded in something deeper, something earned. Jonathan exhaled slowly, the sound barely audible, but enough to shift the air between them. For a moment, he looked away, toward the window, toward the city that had always moved at his pace, always responded to his decisions. Then he looked back. And this time, when he met Marcus's eyes, there was no distance left in it, only a quiet acknowledgement that something important had just changed. The air in the room felt different now, quieter but heavier, as if the silence itself carried meaning that had not existed an hour ago. Jonathan Blake did not step back. He remained where he was, standing across from Marcus, studying him with a level of attention that no one in that building had likely ever given him before. The distance between them was small, but the difference in how they had entered that room and how they now stood inside it was something neither of them needed to say out loud. Jonathan's gaze dropped briefly to the janitor badge clipped to Marcus's shirt, the plastic edge slightly worn, the name printed in simple black letters. Marcus Reed. Nothing about it suggested expertise, authority, or influence. And yet, a few minutes earlier, that same man had stopped a decision that could have undone years of work. Jonathan's jaw tightened slightly, not with frustration, but with realization, the kind that arrives quietly and stays. "You said your father taught you that," he said, his voice measured, almost reflective now. "What did he do?" Marcus shifted his weight just slightly, not uncomfortable, just grounding himself. "He was an accountant," he replied. "Small firm. He used to review contracts for local businesses. Nothing big, but he paid attention. He always said people do not hide problems in big bold letters. They hide them in sentences that look normal." Jonathan nodded once, slowly, as if the explanation fit into something he had overlooked, something he had once known but stopped seeing. Across the room, one of the junior lawyers quietly gathered the last of the documents, glancing up briefly before looking away again, as if unsure whether he was witnessing a conversation or a shift in something larger. The city beyond the glass remained unchanged, sunlight reflecting off distant buildings, traffic moving in steady lines, everything outside continuing exactly as before. But inside, the pace had altered. Jonathan took a step closer, not imposing, not commanding, just narrowing the space between them enough to make the moment more direct. "Do you know how close that was?" he asked, not accusing, not testing, but stating a fact that still carried weight. Marcus met his gaze without hesitation. "Yes, sir," he said. "Close enough that it would have looked like your decision." The words settled in a way that numbers and reports never could. Jonathan exhaled slowly, his hand brushing lightly against the edge of the table as if grounding himself in something solid. For a moment he said nothing. Then he turned his head slightly toward the empty seats around the table, the places where people had sat with confidence just minutes ago, and then back to Marcus. "They trusted the structure," he said quietly. "The reputation? The process?" Marcus nodded. "Most people do," he replied. "That is why it works." The simplicity of the answer did not weaken it. It sharpened it. Jonathan's expression shifted again, not dramatically, but enough to reveal something beneath the surface, something closer to humility than authority. He reached up, adjusted his cuff slightly, then let his hand fall back to his side. "And you?" he asked. "Why did you not stay quiet?" Marcus did not answer immediately. His eyes moved briefly, not away, but inward, as if measuring the weight of the question before speaking. "Because it was wrong," he said finally. "And because someone needed to say it before it became too late." The room held that answer without resistance, without interruption, as if it had been waiting for it. Jonathan looked at him for a long second, then gave a small, almost imperceptible nod, not as a dismissal, not as a command, but as recognition. And in that moment, the line that had separated them earlier did not disappear, but it no longer defined the space between them. The silence did not break right away, it settled, deep and steady, like the room itself was absorbing what had just been said. Jonathan Blake stepped back half a pace, not retreating, just creating space, his eyes drifting once more toward the glass wall where the late morning light had shifted slightly, casting longer reflections across the floor. The city outside moved without pause, cars threading through intersections, people crossing streets, unaware that inside this room, something far quieter but just as significant had taken place. Marcus remained where he was, his hand now resting loosely on the handle of the mop, not as a shield, not as a reminder of his position, but simply because that was where it had always been. Neither man rushed to fill the silence. It stretched, but it did not feel empty. It felt earned. Jonathan's gaze lowered briefly to the contract still resting on the table, closed now, its contents contained but not forgotten. He walked back toward it slowly, his fingers brushing the edge of the folder as he passed, then stopping beside it, one hand resting lightly on the surface. The leather of his shoes made a soft sound against the floor, each step deliberate, measured, grounded in thought rather than urgency. For a moment he said nothing. Then, almost to himself, he spoke. "I built this company on precision," he said, his voice quieter than before, less for the room and more for the realization settling within him. "Every number checked, every detail reviewed. I trusted that process. He paused, his thumb pressing lightly against the edge of the folder, feeling the weight of it in a way that had nothing to do with paper. And still, something like this almost slipped through. The words did not carry frustration. They carried clarity. Marcus listened without interrupting, his expression unchanged, steady, respectful, but not distant. He understood the tone, the shift from authority to reflection, the moment when control gave way to understanding. Processes are only as careful as the people inside them, Marcus said quietly. Sometimes people stop looking closely when they believe everything is already under control. Jonathan nodded slowly, not in agreement alone, but in recognition of something deeper, something he had seen before but had not named until now. The room felt smaller, not physically but in focus, as if everything unnecessary had been stripped away, leaving only what mattered. One of the junior staff members quietly slipped out of the room, closing the door gently behind them, leaving the two men alone with the quiet hum of the building around them. The faint sound of an elevator bell echoed somewhere down the hall, distant, almost irrelevant. Jonathan straightened slightly, not returning to his earlier posture, but finding a new balance, one that held both authority and awareness. He turned back toward Marcus, his expression composed, but no longer distant. "You did not hesitate," he said. "You saw something that did not feel right, and you stepped forward." Marcus gave a small, almost unnoticeable nod. "It did not feel like a choice," he replied. "It felt like something that needed to be done." The simplicity of the answer settled into the room with a quiet weight. Jonathan looked at him for a moment longer, then shifted his gaze toward the door, toward the hallway where the rest of the building continued as if nothing had changed. But something had. Not in the structure, not in the numbers, but in the way one man had chosen to speak and another had chosen to listen. And in that stillness, between the echo of what nearly happened and the quiet of what had been prevented, the room held a kind of clarity that did not need to be announced, only understood. Jonathan Blake did not speak right away, but the shift in his expression was unmistakable, not dramatic, not forced, just a quiet recognition settling into place, as if a final piece of something unseen had just clicked. He walked back to the table once more, not to revisit the contract, but to look at the room itself, the empty chairs, the scattered reflections of glass and light, the space where authority had just been challenged by something far simpler and far more grounded. His hand rested briefly on the back of one of the chairs, fingers curling slightly against the smooth leather, then releasing, as if even that small contact carried thought. When he turned again, his attention returned fully to Marcus, no hesitation now, no distance left to close. "You saved more than a deal today," he said, his voice steady, low, but carrying a clarity that did not need emphasis. "You protected something that took years to build." The words were not offered as praise in the usual sense. They were measured, intentional, grounded in fact rather than emotion. Marcus stood still, absorbing them without reaction, his posture unchanged, his presence the same as it had been from the moment he first spoke. "I just pointed something out," he replied quietly. "You made the decision." Jonathan gave a slight shake of his head, not dismissing the answer, but refining it. "Most people would have stayed quiet," he said. "Especially in a room like this." Marcus's eyes moved briefly across the table, then back. "Most people do," he said. "That is why those things stay hidden." The simplicity of the exchange did not lessen its impact. It sharpened it. Jonathan took a slow breath, then reached down and picked up the contract, not to read it again, but to hold it for a moment, feeling the weight of what it represented, not just the risk, but the assumption that had almost allowed it to pass. He closed it firmly, then set it aside, not as something to revisit, but as something resolved. The motion was quiet, but final. Then he stepped forward again, this time stopping directly in front of Marcus, close enough that there was no separation left between position and presence, only two people standing in the same space, on equal ground for this moment. "What is your schedule like today?" Jonathan asked. The question landed differently than anything before it, not sharp, not probing, but open, unexpected. Marcus blinked once, just slightly, then answered without hesitation. I finished this floor, then the east corridor, he said. After that, the afternoon rotation. Jonathan nodded, taking in the answer as if it mattered, as if the details of a routine he had never noticed before now held weight. He glanced briefly toward the hallway, where the faint movement of staff continued in the background, then back to Marcus. That can wait, he said calmly. No command. No urgency. Just a decision. Marcus did not move immediately. He studied Jonathan for a brief second, not questioning, but understanding the shift in direction. Sir? He asked, not out of confusion, but out of respect for clarity. Jonathan's expression remained steady. I want you to sit in on the next review, he said. Not as staff. As someone who sees what others miss. The words settled into the space between them, not loud, not dramatic, but unmistakable in what they meant. Marcus's hand tightened slightly on the handle of the mop, not from uncertainty, but from the weight of being seen in a way that had never been offered before. The room held that moment, quiet and still, as something shifted once again, not in structure, not in hierarchy, but in recognition. Marcus did not answer right away, not because he did not understand, but because the moment itself felt unfamiliar, like stepping into a space that had never been open to him before. His eyes shifted briefly, not away, but inward, measuring the weight of what had just been offered. The handle of the mop rested lightly in his grip, a quiet reminder of where he had started the morning, of what had been expected of him when he first walked into this building. I am not sure I belong in that room, he said finally, his voice calm, not resisting, just honest. Jonathan Blake did not react immediately. He studied Marcus for a moment, not with impatience, but with a steady clarity, as if the answer he was about to give had already formed before the question was finished. You were already in that room, he replied, his tone even, grounded. And you were the only one who saw what mattered. The words settled without force, without pressure, simply placed where they could not be ignored. Marcus held his gaze, the hesitation in his posture easing slightly, not disappearing, but shifting into something steadier, something more certain. Across the room, the quiet hum of the building continued, distant footsteps passing in the hallway, the faint echo of a door closing somewhere beyond the glass. Life moved on, unchanged, but inside this space, the meaning of what had just happened lingered. Jonathan stepped to the side of the table and pulled out a chair, the motion simple, unceremonious, but intentional. The chair did not carry a title or a label. It was just a place to sit, offered without condition. He did not gesture dramatically, did not insist. He simply left it there, then stepped back, allowing the choice to exist without pressure. Marcus looked at the chair, then back at Jonathan, then at the table where the contract had nearly been signed. The polished surface reflected the light from above, steady and clear, no longer hiding anything beneath it. He took a slow breath, then released the handle of the mop, letting it rest gently against the wall where it had been leaning since he entered. The small motion felt larger than it looked, like setting something down that had defined his place in the room. He stepped forward, each movement measured, not rushed, not hesitant, just deliberate. When he reached the chair, he paused for a brief second, his hand resting lightly on the backrest, feeling the smooth surface beneath his fingers. Then he sat. No announcement. No reaction from the room. Just a quiet shift, a new position taken without ceremony. Jonathan watched him, not with approval, not with surprise, but with a calm acknowledgement that something had changed in a way that did not need to be explained. He returned to his place at the table, but this time, when he sat, the distance between them felt different, not defined by roles, but by the moment they had just shared. The contract remained closed, pushed slightly aside, no longer the center of attention, replaced by something less visible but far more important. For a while, either of them spoke. The silence returned, but it no longer carried tension. It carried understanding. And in that quiet, between what had almost happened and what had been prevented, the room held a new balance, one that did not depend on titles or positions, but on something simpler, something harder to ignore once it had been seen. The room remained still, but it no longer felt heavy. It felt clear. Sunlight had shifted across the table, stretching longer now, reflecting softly against the polished surface where the contract still rested, closed and quiet, no longer a threat, just a reminder. Marcus sat with his hands resting loosely in his lap, his posture steady, not trying to occupy more space than he needed, but no longer shrinking from it either. Across from him, Jonathan Blake leaned back slightly in his chair, his gaze not fixed on the documents or the skyline, but somewhere in between, as if he was seeing both differently now. For a moment, nothing moved. Then Jonathan reached forward, not for the contract, but for a blank notepad placed near the center of the table. He slid it across, stopping it gently in front of Marcus. A pen followed, placed beside it with the same quiet precision. There was no instruction, no explanation, just the simple act of making space for a voice that had nearly been ignored. Marcus looked down at the notepad, then at the pen, his fingers resting briefly on the edge of the paper, feeling its weight, its possibility. He did not write immediately. He did not need to. The moment was not about proving anything. It was about being present. Jonathan watched him for a second, then gave a small nod, almost to himself, before standing. He walked toward the window, hands settling at his sides, looking out over the city that had always reflected his decisions back at him in numbers, in deals, in outcomes. Today, it reflected something else. Something quieter. Something human. Behind him, Marcus remained seated, the pen now lightly in his hand, not pressed to the page, just held, as if understanding that this was not the end of something, but the beginning of being seen differently. The hallway outside carried the faint rhythm of footsteps, distant voices, the ordinary movement of a building returning to its routine. Inside, the stillness remained, not empty, but complete. Jonathan turned slightly, just enough to bring Marcus back into his view, and for a brief second, their eyes met again. No words were exchanged. None were needed. The distance that had once defined them had been replaced by something far simpler and far more lasting. Respect. Marcus lowered his gaze back to the page, the tip of the pen hovering just above it, as if the next line he wrote would not just be ink, but proof that presence, clarity, and courage could exist anywhere, even in places where no one expected to find them. The light continued to move, slow and steady, stretching across the table, across the floor, across two men who had entered the same room from different worlds and left it standing in the same quiet truth. And in that silence, nothing needed to be said for everything to be understood.